So welcome, everyone. We're going to just give it 1 minute to let some people that look like they're lined up to join in. We welcome those that are being live streamed here as well. We appreciate everyone joining us here this evening to talk about some of the current updates that are going on with various activities around the country. And we'll kind of launch into this by describing some great successes that we're experiencing. Everyone probably has heard by now that South Dakota became the 14th state to pass the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And that's a great milestone to get us started in this legislative session. Nebraska is a unique legislature in that it's a unicameral legislature, meaning that it only has one legislative body, so they don't have a House and a Senate where they have to pass bills back and forth. They do it all in one legislative body, and they today passed the KCPA 39-0, which included a vote by Senator Lippincott, who had filed a kratom ban bill. And when I was there in Nebraska and had the opportunity to speak with him after he made his presentation on the ban, he expressed at the time that he was willing to listen and understood that it was a pretty high hill to get to a ban, but he obviously concurred that regulations are important, and he joined as one of those 39 votes. He didn't just walk away and not vote, he actually participated, which we thought was great. We have a number of other states in which we're being very active in the various efforts to get the KCPA. But before I get to those, I want to address one of the issues that everyone is seeing emerging that's part of a more global strategy by the anti-kratom forces, and that is to develop this local ban strategy. And the thinking there, as best as we can determine, is that they see these local officials more susceptible to arguments that are emotionally driven when they tell them stories about how they've lost loved ones and how kratom is the culprit in all of this. That's becoming a growing trend in order to pick off some of these localities. We're seeing that continue in Louisiana and Mississippi. We're seeing it in Illinois, in Massachusetts, and it's a trend that continues to be pushed. And we obviously have to address it because the clear science and the evidence and data that's associated with all of these kinds of efforts in order to mislead public officials into thinking that kratom is a dangerous substance relies upon the emotion of the argument and not about the evidence and data that really should be the underpinning for any kind of decision that would deprive a consumer of access to an otherwise safe product that is consumed responsibly, that is manufactured properly with good manufacturing practices, that isn't adulterated, and in fact is labeled with directions of use that allow for people to responsibly use these products. The mentality that is being used in promoting these anti-kratom efforts is one that we're going to have to adjust to. And we've got a team that's assigned to these local bans right now, and they're working on them. One of the hazards of dealing at this level is that when the anti-kratom people convince some local government official to make the recommendation for banning, it's kind of a very narrow look at what the facts are. In fact, it's non-existent generally to let them explore what the real evidence and data is on the safety of these products. And so you end up with very quick action. We don't get much notice, and we're particularly handicapped by the fact that that Facebook is still continuing despite our best efforts. And while it may be improving a little and is on the pathway to getting resolved, we currently are blocked from knowing about many of these local bans, even when it's made public, because many of these local jurisdictions rely upon Facebook as their primary dissemination of the agendas and the scheduling for these things. So sometimes we don't even know until they're happening. A great case of this was in Riverside, California, where we only had a day and a half notice. We had to scramble. One of our leading advocates had gone on a family vacation, and so we were a little handicapped in that regard too. So getting the notice out was very difficult. And we all know that emails don't always get read. And so that's part of the problem too. So I know that there were some that were concerned that they didn't know about the Riverside thing, and the Riverside deliberations in California, and that there were some complaints that had they known they would have participated. But even in those cases, we found that our emails weren't opened, even with the short period of time that we had to disseminate that information. But we obviously are going to be working on doing the best we can under those circumstances in order to get the word out, because there's nothing more powerful than, as local as we can get, voices about protecting kratom access for consumers. And the best thing that could happen is for California residents, and the ideal thing is for Riverside, California residents to be participating in that. But that's true in every local jurisdiction that we continue to have these kinds of efforts that are going on. And we're going to effectively counter them as we go forward. So this is something that is on our agenda, and we're going to rely upon all of you in the advocacy community to help us. This is one of the problems we run into with the number and the volume of work that has to be done with the number of these proposed bans around the country. So stay tuned and please participate as best you can in helping us in promoting what we think is the baseline for good science to drive good public policy with respect to kratom. And there's no better evidence than you see the various attempts by the trial lawyers, by the anti-kratom advocates, by the kratom danger awareness people to get the pharmacy boards in the states interested. They used that tactic in Virginia, and it was denied. They did it in the Washington Board of Pharmacy Quality Control Commission. It was denied. And we've seen in the past, it was denied in Ohio, it was denied in Nevada. The Controlled Substances Board in Wisconsin agreed that the scheduling that was done by the legislature did not meet the 8 factors that under the Wisconsin law mirror the federal law, and they should not have scheduled it. And the only disagreement there is that the the Controlled Substances Board thinks that the legislature should correct their scheduling, when in fact they hold the inherent power under the statute to do it themselves, and they're in fact the arbiters of those requirements. And so we're working on getting a petition in to try to resolve that problem. So these are ongoing issues that we're going to have to deal with. We know that the activism by the other side is real, and they continue to push hard on all of these kinds of issues that we're working on right now. So one of our goals is going to be that let me go on hold for 1 second here. I'll be right back. I apologize.
All right. We have a forum. Maybe we got to vote.
That's fine. Let's reject my motion.
Yeah, but I think the motion.
Is it a motion to accept
all of
or
our votes
reject?
have to be in public, unless we do them by unanimous consent. So what we're talking about is we do unanimous consent by email, where the motion is to
My apologies. I hope everyone can hear me now. Apologies for that interruption. But the bottom line here is we work through these bans that are being recommended at the state level. We continue to see them pop up, even in state legislatures. And we have one that is going to have a hearing on Monday morning in Iowa, or Monday afternoon. And so you should get a notice if you haven't already about that particular issue. That is, we're going to need some advocates, particularly in Iowa, but also from around the country to weigh in about the ban. And then the following day is the hearing for the Kratom Consumer Protection Act in the Iowa legislature. So again, a burden that we have to meet and address in order to convey the position that all of us have here. So I think that we're going to lean on you hard in order to get your voices to be heard. And we, of course, will have our voices there in person testifying in both of those hearings on the Monday afternoon on the ban bill and on Tuesday morning. It's early in the morning in Central Time there in Iowa. So please help us with those obviously advocacy opportunities that are very important. Then I think it's important for us to look at kind of some of the challenges that we're currently looking at in existing legislatures. We've got an opportunity in Montana to get a bill passed this year. We have an excellent opportunity that has arisen, I think, in Rhode Island, where the governor and we have negotiated the framework. It's not the ideal KCPA. It's not something that we would come up with ourselves, but the governor is committed not to veto this bill, and it's something we can live with. And so Rhode Island presents a real opportunity. At the end of March, there'll be a hearing in Arkansas, another ban state, as we work forward. We're working hard in Indiana right now to do the same kind of thing to overturn a ban. And in Vermont, we have a reasonable chance there in working with the legislature because they are interested in regulating versus allowing the ban to continue. So those are all good things that are happening, and we'll keep you posted as we go forward on those kinds of initiatives. We have a ban bill filed in Illinois, and then competing Kratom Consumer Protection Acts. And this is one of the difficulties that we're running into, that is a philosophical difference between industry groups and a consumer advocacy group such as ours. And the interest of the trade associations are different. And they tend to want to be protective of specific markets for their products or a limited range of products. And we continue to oppose those initiatives because we think that any properly formulated product should be available to consumers as long as there is a reasonable basis for safety under the conditions of use. And in evaluating the product, there's a determination made that there's not going to be a reasonable basis for someone to be harmed or injured by that product. And those, of course, are the federal standards that are used in the evaluation for dietary supplements. But some of these issues get very tricky when you have one product manufacturer that wants to exclude others. And one of the biggest issues there is the 7-hydroxymetrogenine products. The American Kratom Association has consistently taken the position that everything that is in the marketplace, every single product, has to meet the federal standard for a reasonable basis of safety under conditions of use, and importantly, prior to market entry. We were led to believe that there was a sufficient basis of research for 7-hydroxymetrogenine products to be on the marketplace, and that has not proven to be the case in evaluations that we have made in talking to scientists along the way. The other category of concern for us is that when a 7-hydroxymetrogenine product is marketed, that it should not be marketed as a kratom product, because it is not. We believe that a kratom product should be, the majority of the content of that product should be metrogenine, the base alkaloid of the kratom product and plant, and that 7-hydroxymetrogenine, which is synthesized and therefore isolated and then enhanced, making metrogenine a low-level ingredient in that product, is not a kratom product. And we will continue to advocate for that. We will work in legislatures as we pass the KCPAs to make sure that we define what a kratom product is. We will make sure that the definition of the 7-OH content cannot exceed more than 2% of the overall fraction of alkaloids in that product, and that would exclude the vast majority, if not all, of the 7-hydroxymetrogenine products that are on the market today. There should be no doubt about where the AKA stands on those issues. If there is a novel product that is developed and it is not a kratom product and it is in fact a synthesized version, it has to fall or rise based on their scientific evidence and the evidence and data that will support the market entry that is established by the DSHEA Act and the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And that's the position that we will continue to take and we will advocate for in state legislatures. It's our personal belief that these enhanced and isolated 7-hydroxymetrogenine products that are synthesized pose a real risk to consumers and that they are inappropriate for marketing, and yet consumers are purchasing them, we think largely because they've been misled. But make no mistake that when you take a 7-hydroxymetrogenine product, it hits you. It hits you hard. At the recent CHAMP show that I attended in conjunction with our presentation from the American Kratom Association, at that event, as I walked the floor of the CHAMP show and saw dozens and dozens of 7-OH manufacturers with booths there, some very impressive booths, obviously showing that they're very successful in the marketplace. Time after time, the people manning those booths told me how this was better than Kratom. And the reason it's better than Kratom is because it hits you harder. And if it hits you harder, it's not Kratom. There are lots of things that can hit you harder. And that this is, of course, is a very significant part of what we're doing. The other issue that has come up that is important for us to understand and to unite behind is what is being characterized inappropriately by the Food and Drug Administration and by those who are anti-Kratom to claim that there is a toxic level of Kratom that is going to cause a fatality. There is no scientific evidence or data that supports that theory. The closest they come is a reference to a study that was done, peer-reviewed and published by NMS Labs, which is the leading forensics toxicology firm in the country. And they published a paper where they analyzed the levels of 7-hydroxymetrogenine that were present in the bloodstream of the decedent. And then they just said, look, we can evaluate based on the data what the mean point is and where it should be a level of concern. And they arrived at 1,000 nanograms per milliliter of metrogenine in the bloodstream of the decedent. Now, importantly, they don't say that that is a toxic level. In fact, they say in the paper that they don't know if there is a toxic level or what that toxic level is. And there are documented instances of people that have done blood work that are walking around just fine, unimpaired, and doing fine with multiples, sometimes 12,000 nanograms per milliliter, and don't evidence any adverse events along the way. And when you look at what happened in the FDA dose finding study, where they took 12 grams of material that was ingested within a 5-minute period, now that's 12,000 nanograms per milliliter. All they saw was nausea that was induced in that short period of time, and that was true for the placebo group as well. So the idea that anyone would suggest that the NMS Labs Papson paper says that there is a toxic level of 1,000 nanograms per milliliter, that simply is not accurate, and it's being mischaracterized along the way. In the recent 4th International Kratom Conference Symposium that was held at the University of Florida last month, there was a discussion in detail about 7-hydroxymetrogenine, and the representative of the NMS Labs made the point that he's been advising medical examiners that they need to be very careful in their characterization of Kratom as a cause of death because the 7-hydroxymetrogenine levels are so unstable. If you ingest a 7-hydroxymetrogenine product, and if it were to kill you, it washes out of your bloodstream so quickly that when they do the autopsy and draw the blood, they can't find 7-hydroxymetrogenine in the bloodstream because of its instability, which is a concern if we're going to start categorizing what the cause of death was, and if in fact is attributable to something like 7-hydroxymetrogenine or the metabolite of or the extraction of that to metrogenine pseudodoxal. We ought to find the truth, and a medical examiner ought to be the gatekeeper for that truth rather than being the person that rushes to judgment. There's a case that's reported in Ohio. There are 2 cases that are important here. One, the most recent one, is that there's a mother who believes that Kratom killed her son. And it showed a blood level of 980 nanograms per milliliter, somewhere in that range. And her conclusion, without any doubt, she believes that Kratom caused the death of her son, contributed in large part, I suspect, by the medical examiner who made that conclusion. And yet there were other substances in the bloodstream of the decedent that could be equally causative to a death, and that might have helped in inducing seizures, which this young man apparently had a history of. And so, again, it's about identifying and finding the truth along the way. And then you have the circumstance where the mother in Ohio, a couple of years ago, who discovered her son passed away, when the coroner's investigators showed up, saw a bag of kratom product on the nightstand of the decedent. They said this is a kratom death, and this is something that the mother contested strongly. She argued with him, and finally he said, "Okay, I get it. You believe that kratom saved your son. He's been 5 years free from the addiction that he suffered from. So I'm going to let the tox screen speak for itself. That will take 8 to 12 weeks for us to get it back." Turns out they went to NMS Labs. The next morning, at 10 a.m. in the morning, the coroner himself calls this mother and says, "I have sufficient evidence available to me right now to classify this as metrogenine intoxication causing the fatality." He had no evidence other than a bag of kratom at the scene. They hadn't even done the tox screen at that point. When the tox screen was done, this young man had, I think, around 250 nanograms per milliliter. And the mother called me and said, "What can I do? And will you help me?" And so we ended up agreeing that the best course of action would be to sue the two coroners that were involved in the autopsy and in the evaluation of the toxicology report that was provided by NMS Labs, that then they believed allowed them to make a conclusion about whether kratom was the cause of death. And when we sued them, one of the parties involved, of course, was NMS Labs. And when they talked to our attorneys, the NMS Labs people said, "Look, we would not have called this a kratom death. The levels of metrogenine were too low. We don't think that it was a contributing factor in any way." So we wouldn't have drawn that conclusion. And our attorneys said to NMS Labs, "Great, what else was in his bloodstream that would have allowed for the conclusion to be drawn one way or the other?" And they said, "Well, we weren't asked to test for anything but metrogenine." Again, a serious deficiency in the post-mortem death investigation protocols. And of course, that's what the Centers for Disease Control advocates, that there ought to be a standardized post-mortem investigation protocol put in place so there's consistency. And in that particular case in Ohio, there was none. It was completely the incorrect conclusion that was drawn by a medical examiner who was influenced by the FDA and their rush to judgment, saying kratom should be listed as a cause of death anytime it appears and is identified as in the bloodstream along the way. The outcome of that case was instructive, because after the coroners were going to be required to go to depositions and under oath document the basis upon which they drew the conclusion, they agreed to change the cause of death to undetermined, and they did so, and this is important, based on their review of new and emerging peer-reviewed published literature on the safety profile of kratom. And that was even before the FDA did their dose-finding study that I referenced earlier. So the bottom line is that you have a right now predilection by the medical examiners to just follow the FDA's narrative about kratom, about how dangerous it is, and they don't have the benefit of seeing, as we do in real time, how the FDA's claims about the dangers of kratom have fallen apart. And they themselves at the FDA refused to attend the federal court hearing in the Southern District of California last year when ordered by the judge to do so. And they explained to the judge that they have not yet, the FDA, have not yet come to the determination that kratom is dangerous. Flies in the face of 10 years of narrative, of Federal Register posts where they say under factor 6 of the 8 factors required for scheduling, which the FDA claimed it met, it said there's an imminent threat to the safety of the American people from consuming kratom. And then they walked away from that. No, the FDA doesn't acknowledge it publicly. They don't, it's not updated on their website. They still have stuff back from 2016 where then Commissioner Gottlieb says kratom is an opioid and kratom is dangerous. Emerging science be damned, because we now have more than $100 million of research done and funded by the National Institutes on Drug Abuse. And you have the director of NIDA testifying before Congress that kratom should be available to people as a harm reduction measure because it potentially can help them wean off of opioids, which we know is public health crisis #1 in America today. So these are important factors that need to be considered, and yet all of this is happening where the anti-kratom forces know that they can no longer make their argument with any credibility with a body that is sophisticated enough at the state legislative level or at the pharmacy board level or at the controlled substances board level. So they try to go and burrow down into local community, county boards of supervisors or parishes or police juries. All of that are people, well-intentioned citizens that simply don't have the resources, the staff to dig in. And it's our obligation to inform them as best we can and to fight on those battlegrounds so that we can do this. And when you see these unfortunate news stories, and those that watch the Ohio news story that was just up in the last couple of days, and they say unsupportable conclusions about kratom. They reference, for example, when I talked to the reporter, she said, "Oh, well, the DEA calls it a drug of concern." I said, "Yes, they call it a drug of concern. They should, because it is something that was proposed for Schedule 1 classification. And so, of course, they're going to put it on their radar and they're going to list it as a drug of concern. But what they want to see is the signal. And the signal of safety is determined by reports of adverse events and deaths. And this is where they fall on their faces, because the DEA has never listed in their National Drug Threat Assessment paper that they publish almost annually, they've never listed kratom as a serious threat to the American people. And they fall back on this drug of concern, which is merely a classification for the DEA to continue to gather information, is simply ridiculous the way they do it. So this information that these medical examiners are relying on is just got to turn the tide to the truth of the matter. There was a national medical examiners group that met in Baltimore last week, and they heard a presentation by Dr. Marilyn Eustace that was a standing room only by medical examiners participating in that symposia. And they got to hear firsthand an evaluation of how it is a mistake to leap to that conclusion that because the kratom is detected in the bloodstream, that is the cause of death. This is critically important to us as we go forward. And we're going to look at new strategies that will help spread the word about this misinformation that is being based on inaccurate medical examiner and coroner autopsy reports, because we simply need to deliver the truth to the families and to the public as they evaluate what the right course of action for public policy ought to be on kratom products. So this is something that we'll continue to work hard on and continue to seek your advice on. Some of the other states that we're obviously engaged in right now, Ohio's one of them with the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. In Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. New York's got a lot of these, starting to get these local bans ginned up. In Massachusetts, in Vermont, in North Carolina and South Carolina. There's an effort to revisit in Florida, the KCPA. And let me just stop there and say something that I think is important. Some of this battle that's going on between organizations is illustrated best in the state of Florida, where it's a very simple calculation. There is an interest by the company that funds the Global Kratom Coalition to try to create mini FDAs in these local governments. And whether they intend it or not, what that does is it ups the registration fees for the enforcement of those provisions. And so they create these very detailed, specific, costly regulatory schemes, rather than just saying it is the model that's followed by the federal government for all dietary and botanical supplements, which is a self-regulatory environment. The Global Kratom Coalition group wants to come in and say, oh, well, you ought to test for things like how the leaves are milled over in Indonesia. And the only way the state can do that is to hire consultants or to have people over in Indonesia monitoring how it's done, rather than relying upon a test. And this is the important criteria for raw materials coming out of Indonesia or Thailand or anywhere else it comes in Southeast Asia, to evaluate the test to make sure that it's free from contaminants and microbial contaminants, and that it doesn't contain inappropriate heavy metals or anything like that. And you can do that with testing, and you don't have to have someone there supervising it. But the real issue is the milling procedures limit the product formulations at the end. And this is about, in our judgment, and it looks like it consistently, limiting availability of products here in the United States. And it's anti-competitive and it's anti-consumer, because as you drive up the costs that are needed to regulate that under that regulatory scheme. You end up with higher fees, and that drives costs of products and registration fees in those states for manufacturers. Small and mid-sized companies are out because they can't afford it. The best example was, of course, California, where the registration fees were going to be $112,000 in the first year, $83,000 after they'd set up the organization to do it, and that's per product per year. And that, of course, favors a company that has 1 or 2 products and has a big market, but for a company that has 40 or 50 products, that gives consumers choices and allows them to have varying kinds of product formulations for varying kind of uses, puts them out in the cold. And it's just unfair, it's wrong, and that's why that bill fell on its own weight. But we're seeing a similar kind of effort, modified, and maybe they're learning their lesson a little bit in Colorado. But I went to Colorado and testified against the bill that they were promoting because of the fiscal no cost. And of course, the contrast is that those costs are extraordinarily high if you use the regulatory scheme that they're promoting. And we, of course, are working hard against that because we represent consumers. And we're going to continue to fight for you to have availability. I know that there is, within the kratom community itself, a division about whether extract products are good or bad. There is no question that those that are the believers in the whole leaf products, that they don't like extracts. The value that extracts have is twofold. One is that it eliminates all microbial elements to it through the extraction process, limited by the USP 467 extraction methodology that is approved for these kind of products and recognized by the FDA. And then the second value is that it gives you a very standardized dose. And so you know exactly what you're getting. If you take a powdered kratom product, your mid count could range in a wide variance from batch to batch, and depending on when the material was picked and all kinds of variables. And so there's less of a precision that's associated with whole leaf product. But whole leaf product also has the benefit of, the most that can happen to you with taking a whole leaf product is that you might get nausea if you have a product that's too potent, for example, with a high MIT content that you may not be used to. So these are continuing struggles, and they are fundamental philosophical issues that have to be resolved. And unfortunately, we get caught up in some states that would otherwise pass the model KCPA that the American Kratom Association has advocated for a long time, now with 14 states that have passed it against this narrowly drawn, hyper-intensive regulatory scheme promoted by an industry group that gets in the way. And of course, the objective that we've always had is to protect consumers at the state level, making sure that that basic regulatory framework includes that there be GMP practices followed and that the product formulations do not include any controlled substance or synthesized products or levels of 7-hydroxynitrogenine that exceed 2% of the overall fraction of the product, and make sure that they're age limited. And that system works, and it's accepted by legislators, and they want to take on that challenge to protect their consumers. And then on top of that, you get into the situation with with trade groups that really want to limit the marketplace, to exclude competitors along the way. So this is really a critical time for the kratom community to address what we're going to do. And the bottom line, in my opinion, is that we need to let sanity take hold here, protect consumer access to products with choices that individual kratom consumers can make on a range of products that meet the standard for safety based on their conditions of use, meaning the labeling, and that those that choose to use extract products that are properly extracted and limited in their potency, let them, and those that are using pure powder, let them, as long as it doesn't include any kind of a enhanced potency of 7-hydroxynitrogenine or metrogenine pseudodoxal or any of an isolated alkaloid in the kratom plant that doesn't have that safety profile that is documented by peer-reviewed published literature that has been available. And of course, the other argument here is, what about compounded kratom products? And this, of course, is an emerging controversial issue. And the question is whether a product, when it's been on the market, is safe based on market experience. And I can tell you that on the 7-hydroxynitrogenine side, that's their argument. They say, well, we don't have any current safety data other than anecdotal research. And anecdotal is fine, but it's not determinative. You really need to have good clinical data and good in vivo and in vitro data that demonstrates its safety. So just relying upon market experience to say that there is no significant adverse event. The Poison Control Centers just added in the past week 7-hydroxymetrogenine as one of the categories for reporting because everything was lumped into kratom before. And now it's going to be allow for reports to be done about 7-hydroxymetrogenine. But more importantly, the fact that you cannot test for it, or because of, as I referenced earlier, the instability of 7-hydroxymetrogenine, you really can't identify its causation in an adverse event report. But the FDA now has their own 7-hydroxymetrogenine category, and they're starting to pay attention to it. And the point is, the bottom line is, you cannot rely upon adverse event reports that do not accurately reflect what the circumstances of the adverse event were and what caused them. And so they really need better, more complete, and more robust scientific evidence in order to go forward. And that, of course, at the current time is lacking. But they argue that they have 2 years of market experience without significant adverse events. Now, the scientists say that it binds directly to the mu-opioid receptors. It goes right to the euphoric high center. It goes right to potentially the respiratory suppression center, where metrogenine is a partial agonist and doesn't hit those two sectors of the brain, except in very rare cases, which involve huge amounts of ingesting kratom material. And those typically are associated with personality addictions that just are susceptible to the improper use of products. And it wouldn't matter what's kratom or anything else that they have to be dealing with. So those are important categories. And then on the other side of that, you have this emerging novel product with combinations of kava and kratom. And I have repeatedly said that I don't know what the safety of those products are. It is incumbent upon the manufacturer to demonstrate that, in fact, that they are safe under the conditions of use, meaning labeling, and that they've got to demonstrate that with good scientific evidence and data. And the controversy that's arisen there is that two things have happened. One, in one case, you've got the kava-kratom combination product saying, oh, well, there's sufficient evidence because of market experience. Well, that's what the 7-hydroxymetrogenine people say. And then they say, well, we're working on the science. Well, that's what the 7-OH people say. And then they say, well, no significant adverse events. Well, that's what the 7-OH people say. And nobody is testing for the combination of kava and kratom when it comes to an adverse event currently that we're experiencing right now. So there's a question, not that anything is determinative. And so the burden falls upon the manufacturer in order to demonstrate the safety under the Kratom Consumer Protection Acts that have been passed. And it's ironic that the state of Utah, that's been castigated by the Global Kratom Coalition for lack of enforcement of the KCPA as it relates to 7-hydroxymetrogenine, which now the state of Utah has very aggressively stepped into, but they're also controlling and looking at the safety profile of kava-kratom combination products. So that group that's being blamed for being feckless and ineffective is actually the one that's causing the most problem for the kava-kratom manufacturers right now. Science should resolve these issues. And whatever time it takes in order to get science to the point that it's acceptable by regulators, that's the reality of the world, and they have to live with that. And they don't get a free pass in order to get to the marketplace. We think that novel products are important, and we think that consumer choices are important. And as this kratom community starts to mature, you are going to see different product formulations that are targeted to different consumer populations. One of the favorite terms in marketing is, what can we get that appeals to the soccer moms? The soccer moms that go to Whole Foods to buy products. Well, there will be kratom products on Whole Foods shelves that will be lower mid-content formulations. No question about that, because they'll be looking for the energy boost. And then there's going to be that category of an exploding popularity of kratom in the fitness world, where you're talking about pre-workout and post-workout kinds of benefits that come from the ingestion of kratom products. Again, formulated to that specific population. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's very good kinds of adaptations in the marketplace that we hope will actually expand, because kratom does have these benefits at different formulations for specific kinds of targeted consumer appetites along the way. So we think these are all very important things as we go forward. There are some struggles that we're having in the legislatures this year with revisions that are being made to the KCPAs. It's happening in Florida, it's happening in Georgia, it's happening in Utah, in Colorado, and these are states that we shouldn't be back in spending time and resources in order to defend against something that's already there, but for this aggressive attempt to manipulate the marketplace by trade associations to benefit their products. And so that's a big problem that we're running into as we've gone forward. I'm going to stop there. And I know that, that there are questions and answers. I can't see them in this particular framework that I'm in. So I'm wondering if I can get Mark to kind of read the questions. I'm going to try to log on and see if I can do them, look at them this way. But if Mark, if you could tell us any questions that are up, and you're welcome to do Q&A here on this system, and I'll respond. So one of the questions was, the Iowa bill was just introduced and the hearing is so soon, March 3rd. Any reason for the fast pace? Every legislature is different in the way that they approach bills. And Iowa is fascinating in that the sponsor of the KCPA bill put the bill in and it was assigned to a committee. The committee chairman then assigns the bill to someone on the committee, not to the sponsor of the bill. And we drew a bad card there where the sponsor, the committee sponsor assigned by the committee chairman is a police officer and who doesn't like Kratom. So we've got a real challenge in Iowa because on the other side, you have the Kratom ban bill. There's no rhyme or reason to any of these schedules that are done with these legislatures. So this is just something that we're going to have to deal with as we go forward. Question is, I've heard rumblings about a large shipment that was seized. The FDA agent saying they're all being directed to hold shipments coming through. The new import alert that was just reposted stresses the fact that the FDA is going to become more aggressive in trying to interdict shipments of Kratom coming into the United States. And I think that there's a combination of factors here. One is that they believe that the regulations that were imposed by the Indonesian government, there was an attempt by the Indonesian embassy to go to the FDA and explain to them that the new regulations would require the testing of all Kratom raw materials. And all that did was put a flag up for the FDA to say, oh, now they're going to start reshipping the Kratom. We've been stymied for 4 months in shipments out of Indonesia. So I think what you're seeing here is a reaction by the bureaucracy to try to get in front of this new wave of shipments that are coming in. And we're hopeful that the disruption at the federal level right now with resources being applied to the FDA will force them to go reallocate their resources back into something that's meaningful, like let's stop fentanyl shipments rather than Kratom shipments. And then the question is there any way that we could reasonably meet with Secretary Kennedy to get him to direct the FDA to remove this import alert? We are working with our federal lobbying team, in addition to the refiling of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, to do what's called report language that will direct the secretary to tell the FDA commissioner to only apply the import alert to those importers that are violating the adulteration standard, meaning that they have Salmonella, E. coli, or other contaminants in the raw material, with the burden of proof being on the FDA, and not to enforce it as a broad ban on Kratom. We're hopeful that that report language will be accepted in the FY26 budget. It won't have an immediate effect, but just the fact that the discussions are taking place may jawbone the new FDA commissioner who's up for a hearing here in the next couple of days. And when Commissioner McCary is confirmed, we're hopeful that he'll take a new look at this. And I mentioned it on other calls. One of the strongest anti-Kratom advocates at the FDA has left, where they resigned on the first week in January. And I think that's going to diffuse some of the anti-Kratom narrative at the FDA. And hopefully, as they struggle with some of the Trump administration directives, where they have to reallocate resources, they'll start to look at more serious issues than certainly Kratom presents to them along the way. The import alert never should have been imposed. It was based on 9 deaths in Sweden that the FDA refuses to accurately report on, which was discredited, all 9 deaths in a 12-month period, serious public health issue, but it wasn't Kratom. It was O-desmethyltramadol, an adulterant that was added to a popular Kratom product called Krypton that killed those people. And the FDA to this day will still refer to those 9 deaths in Sweden in all of their submissions under Factor 6 of the Controlled Substances Act claiming that kratom is dangerous. And they cite those 9 deaths as a part of the narrative that they have. So this is the kind of stuff that is tragic when it comes to good public policy being directed by accurate information that's coming in. And the FDA just has not gotten the message yet that they should be telling the truth to the American people. And if you read the FDA Kratom webpage today, it contains absolutely incorrect and false information about kratom. And information that if they wanted to draw a conclusion about it, they're required to go through federal rulemaking procedures under the Administrative Procedures Act, and they refuse to do it. And yet, when you go to California, there are seizures taking place at kratom retailers and distributors, and the California Department of Health is pointing to the FDA and kratom webpage. And that tells you the impact that that has, and it's why we are making this a priority issue for us as we work in this environment to get the FDA's attention to start doing the right thing. Misty asked, what's going on in Utah with the kratom bill there? This is probably one of the most confusing things that I have ever seen in my work in the kratom space. The Department of Agriculture decided several months ago that they were going to delist kava kratom products based on a concern about the safety of the kava kratom formulation. And they have requested, and they are going through an evaluation of those products, which they are entitled to do under the existing KCPA. It's my understanding that the company that is the primary driver of the kava kratom combinations, Botanic Tonics, has gotten support for filing a bill in Utah that, I mean, it's absolutely confusing because what it says in essence is that existing kava kratom products can remain on the market, but new ones can't get on the market. And that when there's an evaluation that is done of the existing kava kratom products, if it's still ongoing at 2 years from now, then they get to remain on the market, but no one else can come on. This is a product protection bill. And the question is, and it's an unknown at this point, if the product is not safe for human consumption, should there be another minute that those products are on the market? And under the evaluation preliminarily that was done, that led to the Department of Agriculture to delist the products, in other words, say they weren't available for sale, immediately that decision was appealed, and the Department of Agriculture turned to the legislature for some guidance. And the guidance that is coming from the Botanic Group, their lobbyists, was to literally give a free pass to existing kava kratom products, block other competitors from getting on there, and then gave this protracted period of time. It was a confusing piece of legislation. I was asked by the sponsor, and by the way, when I met with the sponsor of the bill that they put together, 2 things happened. One is the sponsor was told that the American Kratom Association fully supported the language that was in their bill. That was not true. They had never asked us, nor did they seek our approval of it. And we, of course, were strongly opposed to it because it was anti-competitive and it put consumers at risk until an evaluation made by experts could be done about kava kratom combinations. Then the second problem with it obviously was, why would you allow a product that's currently on the market to continue there until it's been proven safe? And of course, that is something heavily contested by the Botanic Tonics people. Again, it's about science, and I don't know the answer one way or the other about whether it's safe or not. That is a burden that is by the manufacturer presenting the evidence and data to a regulatory body and let them decide. And as I mentioned earlier, the irony of this is Botanic Tonics heavily criticizes the Department of Agriculture in Utah, claiming that they're not enforcing the KCPA. And they cite the fact that they did a shopper survey of the products that were being sold in Utah, many of which were 7-hydroxymetrogenine products that were not registered with the state. And of course, that's a fair criticism. Now, the state took action and they started looking at it, and they're going through these stores and they're pulling 7-OH products. And our solution to that, and one that we fully support, is that we increase the fine on any unregistered product that's identified from the current $5,000 to make it $20,000. That would have 2 effects. One is that you would get a revenue stream that would help the Department of Agriculture increase their enforcement, at least in the short term, until all of those companies came and registered. It would eliminate products that are not qualified for registration, and would compel those who were just not wanting to pay the fee or go through the process of it to come compliant. And that would increase revenues with registration fees and allow the department to properly enforce it. There's a way to do this. The other alternative is to have an excise tax on kratom. And we're not opposed to that if that's the way that the state determines that they want to regulate these products. But the idea is that there are ways in which you make sure that the department has the authority to evaluate whether or not a product is safe or not, and that should be determined by science, not by threats of litigation, not by someone coming in and saying, well, let's continue letting us on the market and just not let anybody else in while we do this. The right course of action is what the legislation that we then proposed would be that to delist those products and then give an adequate amount of time, similar to what happens under the DSHEA Act at the federal level. And the sponsors seemed inclined to do that. And then in the testimony that was provided to the committee, there was a discussion about kava kratom, but then the Botanic Tonics representative, Matt Lowe, the Global Kratom Coalition representative, Matt Lowe, testified and said, oh, well, the problem is that it ought to be an equal playing field. They ought to ban OPMS black products. And the premise for that was that the FDA had put out a consumer advisory on OPMS black products. Well, the FDA has also put out a consumer advisory on all kratom products. It's on the FDA and Kratom webpage. And if we're going to allow the FDA to selectively come after kratom products, and the basis for it is statements by the FDA, then all kratom products are gone. This made no sense. And the idea that they just want to go after a competing product and target them as a way to get their legislation through didn't make much sense to us. And so we continue presently to oppose the current configuration of that language, which is driven by, and I will quote their lobbyists. Their lobbyists said the only thing we are interested in is making sure that our client's product can remain on the market. And when I said to him, what if it's unsafe? He goes, well, they tell us it is. Well, that's not a determination for the manufacturer to make. That's what the department is there for. And this proposed legislation circumvents the role of the department and weakens it so that they are automatically going to have to allow it to continue to be on the market for an extended period of time, and then allows for an additional extension if the product's still under review when the expiration date of 2 years comes by. I don't think you give a free pass to any product on the marketplace for that length of time. And I don't think that you use legislation to try to selectively pick out a competing product, which is determined under federal law as an extract product to be appropriate. And here's the standard for extracts. Kratom extract products are made from metrogeny. There's no other compound involved in it. And the limiting factor under federal standards is what's called USP 467, which controls the solvents that are allowed for use in the extracted kratom product, meaning that it limits the power of the extracted alkaloids when they're done. It allows them to get rid of some of the, obviously, the microbial contaminants, but does not create an unsafe condition. That's what is going on in the extract market. Now, if there is a product, let's say it's OPMS black and it violates the standard, then report it and get it done. The FDA did a consumer advisory, but they've not been able to say you can't buy it. They're not banning it. It was a consumer advisory based on adverse event reports that may or may not have been accurate, and that's something that needs to be adjudicated by a regulatory body, not legislation at a state level, just because one company doesn't like the competing product on the other end. Safety, that's what it should be about. Consumer safety. We should be focused on that and not on competitive advantages, and not let legislation become that vehicle in order to erode competition and to thwart consumer access to safe kratom products. And I think that's the most important thing that we should be focused on as we go forward here. Let me go back and see if there state case fee ban updates. People missed Indiana. We're currently working in the Indiana legislature to get the kratom ban overturned. We're negotiating on some language. We may just get lift the ban and get an age restriction and a definition of what a kratom product is, and then study it for a year. That would be fine with us. In Illinois, we have competing bills. We're working with the Global Kratom Coalition and the Botanicals for Better Health and Wellness, and I think we've agreed on language that we can all support, and hopefully we'll get that bill through. Arkansas has a hearing scheduled at the end of March where we're going to be making our case there, and we'll have hopefully a lot of good witnesses from the scientific perspective that will be working there. In New York, odd state, You don't get consumer testimony. You have to do it outside of the committee hearings. We've got David Carlucci, an excellent lobbyist up there working. I know that there's an effort to get a kratom ban bill going there, so we're going to fight on that, obviously. Massachusetts, again, same situation, competing bills, but our KCPA is now filed and we're working on it. In Mississippi, competing bills, but good news is it looks like the excise tax that would help to regulate kratom, allow the state to do that, is on track to pass. We're hoping that the ban bill will die, and that's yet to be seen. In Connecticut, there was a ban bill, and there's also a age gating bill. And I've been working with the sponsor of the age gating bill to work with the ban bill people to see if they would take a definition of kratom, set an age limit, and then allow the Connecticut Department of Health to study kratom for a year and report back. I'm not sure anything's going to happen, but that's good news if there's not a ban along the way. So that's the status in those particular states as we go forward. Any other questions people have? Let me make sure I haven't missed anything. So 1 second, I got one more message. Sorry we're doing it this way. I just don't have the access to seeing it here. Okay, the last one is Riverside, and clarify how the meeting went. My understanding in Riverside is that they got a 45-day period where they're going to come back and evaluate where we are. And I think that some of our advocates have done terrific work, reached out to the sponsor, and she is willing to meet with us. And we're going to be meeting with them to show them the science. This will be the same exercise we go through for pharmacy boards. And I think there's a serious look at this as opposed to the knee-jerk, let's rush to judgment about kratom. The narcotics, there's a group of narcotics agents that are pushing for regulation, and they're supporting our state KCPA. So we had great conversations with them so far, and we're glad to see that they're willing to look at and support a local regulation. So hopefully that'll weigh in on Riverside too. This is an illustration of how the kratom community, even in difficult circumstances, can rally, because we had no notice of the Riverside hearing that was coming up. I know that there were some frustrations expressed that we hadn't communicated it. We didn't know, and when we did find out, we tried our best to send it out. Sometimes emails get lost and it's difficult, but and without the ability to communicate on Facebook, it's hard. But this one that we have some room to work in, and I understand the frustrations and the complaints of people who like to be involved. We want everyone involved as best as we can. In this case, we didn't have a good channel to get the alert out soon enough, but we're going to be able to be prepared when they bring it back up after this 45-day evaluation period. So help us, work with us, have patience with us. We're not perfect in these things, but sometimes the conditions in the battlefield that we're working on aren't perfect either, and so we have to manage them as best as we can. So I think that's the end of it. Let me just say thank you to everyone that is helping. This is a busy time. I got notice of the Iowa hearing this afternoon, so we're scrambling to get there Monday to address the ban bill, and then our bill the next day. The state legislators they're wound up now and going full steam, and I've been on the road. I went to Pierre, South Dakota, and had the chance to meet with that legislative body. And it was fantastic because even the people that held the view that kratom was potentially dangerous recognized that regulation was better. When that bill passed unanimously in both the House and the Senate, it was a recognition of that fact. And I thought that was fabulous. And when I went to Bismarck, North Dakota, minus 23 degrees, there was a similar sentiment, but the Department of Health came in and said, oh, it's going to cost us $1.7 million. This is a state that has a third or less of the population of Utah that does it for $172,000, and they're going to bump it up to around $250,000. But this is bizarre that these state agencies who get enthusiastic about this regulatory scheme that lets them add more people to their FTEs, they're called full-time equivalents, and to add more lab space and have more authority and they just jack up these fiscal notes. And so we're fighting those. And that's derivative of these proposals that have this intense regulatory schemes and frameworks that are put in place at the state level that they simply cannot match. They cannot become mini FTAs. And we don't want them to be. We want the standard to be set. We want companies to comply with it. And when they violate, we want the states to be the referees to blow the whistle and force them to comply and to demonstrate their compliance with studies and research they do and pay for, not the state. So those are the challenges that we're working on. And with your help, we're going to be successful as we go forward. There are many, many advocates that I could call out by name. And the problem is I'll miss too many of them if I do that. All of you are important to this effort. And even though we may not appreciate you the way that you would like, know that in our hearts that we do deeply, deeply appreciate the effort that you put forth in advocating for kratom. I see it every day. I see it in responses in social media posts. I see it when you respond to a local newspaper or media outlet when they do an anti-kratom story, and I see the comments. I see it evidenced in messages to legislators and to committee chairmen. These are things that happen that are part of an organic kratom community that really has unified. And while we're suffering from some evidence of fatigue because the challenges are huge, what we're doing is fighting for the truth. And even those critics that are out there, our most strident critics, like the kratom danger awareness people, even many of them in that space agree with us that regulation is the best course of action because they know that they can't get it banned. And yet, their extremist leaders keep driving that message, we got to ban it, and it's really not supported by scientific evidence and data. And as Dr. Joie pointed out, when he evaluated the best that the FDA had to offer, the very best of the so-called fatality data, the adverse event reports, and all of the scientific data that they claim led to a legitimate conclusion that kratom met the criteria under the 8 factors to be classified as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act. Dr. Joie didn't say, nah, I don't agree with you. He said it was embarrassingly poor evidence and data. And when I spoke to him, and I told many of you many times, he said, I'm not a fan of kratom. I don't know, but I'm a fan of good science. And I can tell you the FDA didn't deliver. And yet the FDA, because they want to use the credibility that they have as the premier public health agency in America, they should honor that by giving accurate information, by telling the truth. And they're certainly not doing that with kratom right now. And that's why our fight is so important, why everything we've done over the last 8 years, since the first trip down that lane of trying to get it scheduled, they failed consistently. And we're back at it. In the second week in March, we're going to be over at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs with Dr. McCurdy, Dr. Darshan Singh from Malaysia, Dr. Kirsten Smith, Dr. Ed Boyer, Kirsten Smith from Johns Hopkins, Dr. Jack Henningfield from Johns Hopkins, Dr. Ed Boyer from Ohio State University. And we're all going to be over there, and Dr. Chris McCurdy from University of Florida. And they're going to be talking to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs because the FDA is back at advocating for an international scheduling of kratom. So our fights are international. They're tough. They're demanding. And without your support and your help, we wouldn't be as successful as we have been in fighting these battles. So thank you. So I'll leave it at that and wish all of you, not only a good night for the coming weekend, have a great weekend, but Monday, we're back at it in Iowa and on Tuesday. And then you'll have in your inbox lots of other opportunities because these hearings are coming fast.